here today, you guys. We psyched you all out on Friday, but we're here today to have the Culture Dissonance Conversation. So welcome, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. I'm super excited to bring to you guys this episode of the conversation series. One, because we are not letting technology stop us from having this conversation. And two, one of the reasons why I was so excited to bring this conversation to everyone today is because Niven, my lovely guest, who I will introduce in a moment, posted on social media quite some time ago this question about how do you want to be like the top 5 people who surround you at work? And I was like, ooh, this is such a good question. And it would have been really interesting for me to ask myself that question before joining some of the companies that I did, instead of, in retrospect, having left all of those companies that I did. So I really was excited to bring this conversation to the peeps. So here we are today, and we're having the conversation. Good morning to those of you who are joining us live, and it's morning for you. It's afternoon for Niven. Zadina, hello. David, hello. Thank you guys for joining us live. I want, for those of you who haven't joined us live before, this is a conversation. So not just a conversation for Tracy and Niven, but a conversation for all of us. So we're super interested to hear your perspectives, your thoughts, your insights, your questions on the topic, culture dissonance, today. We'll define that for you guys so it has a little bit more of a framing before we get too deep into the conversation. But please share your thoughts. We want to know how you guys have experienced this in the past, or have you not, or how, if you have questions about how to support not doing that for future employees, any type of question you have in the arena, we're super excited for you to share it with us today. So before we get deep dive into this conversation, let's learn a little bit more about Niven. So Niven, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're so passionate about conversations like this.
Thanks, Tracy. Well, I think my sisters would tell you in the world that the reason I'm so passionate about any conversation is that I love the sound of my own opinions. I mean, I beg to differ, although maybe I think that my opinions are worth hearing and sharing. And I think particularly conversations around culture because, you know, implicitly or explicitly, I've been responsible for culture in all of my roles in my career. And I am so delighted that finally the conversation seems to be shifting from culture being this nice, a bit soft and fluffy thing that sits in the responsibility of HR to something that's far more central as the engine room of what's possible or conversely what's not possible in an organization. And so bringing together my experiences with other people's inputs and conversations all over the world on a topic that's interesting. I mean, what a great way to spend a Tuesday afternoon.
Boom. This is how I feel about it too, although there's no better way to kick off my day than having a conversation like this. So Niven, can you start off by sharing with us what your definition of a culture in a business sense is?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there are so many, but the easiest one, I think the one that most people hang their hooks on and their hats on is the one around the way we do things around here. So the things that are accepted, the things that are not accepted, the written and unwritten rules, the symbols and the artifacts, the sense of the smell of a place and what gets you accepted and assimilated and what gets you rejected.
I think this is really important. And I know that as much as I would say that is a common definition, one of the things that I think comes up still a lot, even when we look at that, is the kind of values on the wall way we do things around here and the way we actually do things around here. And I think this is a place where that dissonance starts to play, right? So I would love to hear some of your experience, Niven, on what really creates that, let's just call it like an internal culture dissonance, right? Where we're saying this is what we are, but this is what we actually are. What are some of the things that cause that?
Yeah. Look, so I think first of all, we've got to get pragmatic. Some degree of dissonance is probably almost inevitable. I mean, we're human beings. We're never going to be all that we hope to be. But I think for me, it's almost like an ecosystem. And I have a drawing where I say values are at the center. Sure. But first of all, a couple of thoughts around values. For, can anybody tell me why these values matter? So values that have been chosen, how do they link to the strategy? How do they distinguish who you are and why you choose to be who you are? Because there's interesting research that says so many companies and so many people in companies, if you take away the name of the company, they actually struggle to know which one are their values, because they're also motherhood and apple pie and generic. Respect and integrity and accountability. Yes, we all know this. But it still begs the question, so what? Why do these ones matter? And then, of course, the second point is you might have those as a necessary starting point, but they're not in and of themselves enough. All the things that surround those and bring those to life or are completely dissonant with them. I mean, I think we've got to look at this. So what are some of those things? Well, first of all, it's leadership behaviors. And I always say that leaders get the behaviors that they demonstrate and that they tolerate. So who are the leaders in an organization who are looked up to? Who are the leaders whose stories get told, and how resonant are their behaviors with these values? Because if you've got these values and leaders who are glorified, who are very dissimilar to those values, frankly, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where people are going to take their cues from. I think the second thing is all around your processes and your systems. I mean, I remember working in an organization once, very impressive, huge, complex. And one of their values was customer focus or customer first, something about the customer at the center of everything you do. Again, not massively controversial, hugely aspirational, fine. But when you sat with some of their front-facing people, the people actually dealt with customers as opposed to sat on the 8th floor feeling important, and you looked at the systems they had to work with to try to give an answer to a customer. These legacy systems that sat across 3 screens, and they're trying desperately to keep a smiling face, to appear competent and professional, but they can't figure out what to tell this person because the systems aren't talking to each other. And so all of these executives on high who are really proclaiming and beating their chest about customer first, telling me that, I get it, giving me these systems, clearly the customer is really lost in the list if this is how I'm supposed to serve them. And I think the third one is probably reward and recognition. So what do we reward? What do we recognize? And how many times, sadly, I think in organizations, remuneration can literally become compensation. So we use the words interchangeably. But what am I actually compensating you for? Sometimes it's not just for your skills and your time. I'm compensating you for all the stuff that you have to swallow and all the stuff that you have to accept that is completely opposite to what you said I was coming into. So like I say, to summarize, I think there is inevitably some degree of dissonance, but quite how marked that dissonance is and quite how systemic it is and quite how acknowledged it is. I mean, I think these are important things to think about and to confront actually in cultures.
I think I'm with you on that, because I think my experience that a lot of time there is no awareness in that arena, right? Like there's not an awareness of the dissonance. And so there's not actually anything that can be done about the dissonance because we aren't aware of it. But then I've also noticed that in those types of cultures, there's a lot of fear. And so like the people who are experiencing the dissonance, in your example, the customer service associates, right? I actually had an example of that in my past work environment, and I was not a customer service associate, but I ran our digital marketing program, and there were people who would contact me, not sure how they would get my number, but because this was an email of somebody who was deceased, or this was a phone number that no longer belonged to the person who we were addressing, and there was literally nothing I could do about it, right? There wasn't, like, I could apologize and that's all I could do. And it felt so hard for me because I wanted to be able to do something, but the systems did not allow me to do anything. So I mean, and that's really dissonance in itself, right? In that I would do it this way, but that's not how I'm allowed to do it. Plus, I'm not allowed to share the fact that I would do it this way. So I can't ever possibly do it that way. And so what are let's look at it from a leadership perspective, because I think really, like, at the end of the day, you mentioned it, right? The leadership is dictating this with their behaviors. So what are some of the things that we could be more open to as leaders that would help us to identify whether this culture dissonance exists so that we can do something about it?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. And I mean, to build on what you were saying earlier, look, I think sometimes people aren't aware, but frankly, sometimes they don't want to be aware, because they're in the pound seats. Things are quite cushy for them. They're on the inside of the culture, and the culture as it is and the status quo benefits them. And so anyone who has a concern about it, well, they just don't understand how we do things around here. Well, that's the point. I don't understand your culture. And and I think it's then very easy to dismiss those people as the outliers who just don't get us. And sometimes, yes, you may have made a bad hire of somebody who doesn't fully understand. And for me, it's less about people who fit the culture. No, because I mean, then it's just coming into a slipstream and it's more of the same. But it's about people who contribute to the culture, and particularly at a time of change, can they stretch and flex the boundaries of what the culture is to what it might be? I mean, those are the people that you want. Just more of the same, probably less. People who are sitting on the other side of the chasm from you and saying, I hate this place and I'm not interested in this place and I don't resonate with the culture at all. Well, yes, you don't want that either. But somewhere in the middle are people who do want to overlap in the kind of Venn diagram, but who also want to stretch those boundaries. And so if you are not continuously making hiring mistakes, and of course, if you are, then you need to look at another part of your processes and your culture. But if you're not, what is it that you are repeatedly hearing? Assuming that you're curious enough to ask and humble enough to listen. Because I think especially when you're in a leadership position, the odds are stacked in your favor. The culture works for you. And hearing and understanding and caring enough that it may not work for other people and for enough other people that it becomes an issue. Well, that is in and of itself, I think, an act of leadership. But, it also takes some humility.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting what you share here, because I have some experience with leadership. And one of the things that I celebrate about my leadership style was my curiosity and the belief that I don't know everything, right? Like, just because this works for me doesn't mean that I believe that it works for everybody. And so let's explore it. Let's talk about it, creating space for those types of conversations to happen. And one of the things that was always really interesting for me is that I could find the space to do that for my team. But when it came to how I belonged in the management team, like, I did not feel like I belonged, and that I was constantly looking for new things. I was looking for ways to do things better. I was trying to learn from feedback of employees who had left, who, like, I think if you're going to take the time to provide feedback, that I appreciate that, right? You could just leave and not tell me anything, right? So if you're going to provide feedback, I appreciate that. And I believe I should listen to you, right? This is just a piece of who I am as a person, not that that's right or wrong. But I remember this one scenario where we had a gentleman who had left and provided like a Glassdoor review, and it was not a pretty review. And for months, I asked the management team to talk about it, right? I was like, we have all this feedback from this guy who was a member of my team. And I think it's good feedback. I'd like to talk about it and see how we can incorporate this into how we do things with future employees, because I think it's awful. And for months I got no, this is important, this isn't the priority, this is blah. And eventually it was like, I'm going to schedule a meeting just so we can talk about this. So if you guys don't want to put it on the agenda for the management meeting, I'll schedule this meeting. And the entire time in the meeting, everyone was just like, this is a disgruntled employee, he never got our culture. I was just like, I'm not the same as you people, right? And again, like, I don't believe in like, I'm good and they're bad. I just believe, like, that's the thing when you were talking about culture dissonance, for me was just like, so such a prominent memory, is that I was just like, we are not on the same page at all. And I can look at the documented values, and I'm sure each of us could say how we interpret those and how we are living those, but at the same time, we're still not on the same page. So maybe talk to me a little bit about this in your experience, because one of the things I thought about, I've only had some of these realizations since I left that team. And sometimes I think, what could it have been like if we talked about it, right? Like if that space was available. And I'll say there was a little bit of the like, I'm the CEO, be afraid of me type of mentality that existed there. But how have you seen conversation play into the ability to address culture dissonance?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, as you're telling your story, I mean, I'm remembering two things in my experience, actually both at the same organization. The one was with my team, and at this organization, there was incredibly strict processes and procedures and very arcane rules around your leave. So if you left to the office at 4:30 and working hours were supposed to be until 5, you were actually for the high jump, and somebody was clocking your time, and then it didn't matter that you came in early the next day to make up for it. I, as your manager, was going to get a report every month of who kind of shortchanged the organization out of their work. And I thought, you have got to be joking. I mean, this is the 21st century, people. And if I don't trust my team, I will have a conversation. But I am not spending my time and using somebody else's energy to micromanage at this level. So I said to my team of 6 managers, listen, I'm not giving you permission from here on outwards that tell me if you feel it's important and necessary that you're going early to do something. But there's a difference between telling me I'm going off to fetch my child and asking me, Maya. You don't have to ask me. You're a senior manager. You have my trust and support. Make the decisions that you need to. And if there's a problem in the output, we'll have that conversation. Anyway, it was fascinating. Half of their team could not wait. Took to it like ducks to water. And then the other half of the team, 3 months later, eventually in the management meeting, I said, guys, I have now had it. It has been 3 months of you still asking me for permission with something that I have neither the time nor the inclination to check. I am not your teacher. I'm not your mother. I am a manager and you are my colleagues. Get on with it. And I said, for years, people have complained in this organization around this ridiculous rule. But it reminds me of a bird in a cage. Oh, singing his little heart out. I want to be free. I want to be free. And you open up the bird cage door and, well, now I don't quite know what to do. Okay. And so I think this concept of learned helplessness is a really important one that we can't ignore. And I think it can get to that point where you just don't see this kind of stuff anymore. And I think the second point is around your point of fear, that managers can be scared as well. Scared that they'll have to reinvent themselves, scared that they'll have to do things and confront things that they really don't know how to. And it's that wonderful saying from James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so I think that feeling of, oh, gosh, if I open the Pandora's box of people being unhappy, what might I uncover and what do I do with it? I don't know, so let me not even go there. And so I think to overcome this idea of learned helplessness, this idea of fear of who I might be and might need to become relative to who I think I am, I mean, some conversations can be incredibly powerful, but they're not easy to have. And I think possibly in your experience, being the one person who was pushing for it just made everyone else push back against you even more strongly. Because again, in my experience, I remember once we ran a culture survey in the whole organization, and for 3 years, every department had been intensely unhappy and really showing signs of distress. And I then was made a new manager of a new department. The culture survey was run again. And lo and behold, my team, my whole department is the first department in the history of the organization who actually considers themselves functional and considers themselves healthy and happy. And I was so naive and stupid. I thought, oh, well, I'm sure that other managers in the place are going to ask me, how did you get that right? I mean, how naive could I be? Because, of course, all I got was the cold shoulder, because there goes the excuse. Because the excuse, which was a reasonable sounding one, even though I had no basis in fact, the excuse was, I'm a great manager and I'd love to give you all the support and leeway that you need to thrive and to flourish. But, in this place, given the constraints, I just can't. And then, of course, the moment my team and I are able to do that, well, there goes that excuse out the window. And so I think having a conversation where it's less about you pushing and more about everyone meeting in a place of mutual concern and openness, and probably a fairly large degree of shared fear, that's probably not something you can do. That's something that maybe could have been better done, facilitated.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is 100% my experience, right? Because my company paid for me to go and do Dale Carnegie training. And then I learned all this awesome stuff with Dale Carnegie training. And then I was like, let's incorporate this because this is awesome. Yeah. And everyone was like, yeah, let's do that. Just tell me you don't want to do it, right? Like, I would rather you just be like, and then these are the things that are confusing to me. I'm like, you're going to invest $3,000 for me to go and get this training, but you're really not interested in me incorporating any of the training because it's different than what we do here. So what, like, I'm thankful, super thankful for it, but why would you do that? It's very confusing to me. And just over and over these things, right? Like, these are the types of things that I think are actually team building, that like build a team. And they're like, no, we're gonna go karting. Okay, well, just whatever, fine. I'm not responsible for planning team events, so go and do it. And I will go and do, although by the time I like started to get like checked out of the organization, I'm like, I'm not even gonna do these team building events because I'm not building anything, right? And like, I'm leaving, so it doesn't matter. But I think this happened. So let's talk about this, because in my experience, this happened, I would say, in most of the organizations I worked for, even the organizations that I felt I belonged in more than other organizations. And so one of the things that triggered this conversation was kind of as coming into an organization, either from, because I think it would be really awesome to have this from a potential hire perspective, but also from a hiring perspective. What are some of those things that would be beneficial to be part of the conversation in the hiring process to prevent this type of culture dissonance?
Yeah, interestingly, I posted on LinkedIn last week around potential questions that employers can often ask, so where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? Tell me about some of the failures of your life. And then the potential questions that employees, interviewing employees, could ask. And it was fascinating because it was an updated list based on a first post. It was fascinating, the conversation that happened, because for me, this was very much around an EVP in practice. This is what we're offering. This is what you're looking for. This is what I'm looking for. This is who you are. And can we see if we meet somewhere in the middle? So for me, that seems pretty important, pretty obvious, pretty non-problematic. And a lot of people agreed. So one person wrote a fabulous comment saying how a career coach had pointed out to her that, listen, understand that the employer is actually on your side. They want to find the right person as quickly as possible, as painlessly as possible. So they want you to succeed, because the sooner you succeed, the sooner that they can stop their search. And so all kinds of conversations, and people saying, I'm going to share this with people in my group. I'm going to share this with graduates. And then at the same time, a whole bunch of very powerful, thought-provoking points around, listen, an interview, unless you're very senior or you're being headhunted, an interview is an exercise in power asymmetry. And so, yes, apparently you're the interviewee who's looking for a role, but actually, we think we hold all the power, rightly or wrongly, as the interviewer. And a lot of interviewees, particularly if they're more junior, particularly if they're more desperate, particularly if they just need something to pay the damn bills, who cares about fulfillment? It's about playing a role, giving whatever answers they think is needed. And who cares about if I'm a match? I just need a job. And I think that that's very, very true. And again, at the same time, in situations of power asymmetry, unless you start to take some ownership of your own power, even if it's only by asking one or two of these questions, Where do you see the opportunities for this role in 5 years' time? Never mind where I see it. Why did the previous incumbent leave? Why do people leave this organization? Give me an example of leadership that's celebrated in this organization. I mean, if we can't open ourselves up to the fact that we have the right to ask these questions, again, with respect, with curiosity, with the hope and intention we can find something that works for both of us, well, then, I mean, the thought of thinking about culture and trying to match that, well, that's so far down the line that, it's not even on the table. But I think if you do recognize the value of a culture, if you do recognize that I'm offering something and you're looking for something, and, oh gosh, do they meet and do they match? Then I can't imagine that you wouldn't ask questions around culture, because I think anyone who has been around for a while or had their fingers burnt or learned this the hard way knows that, look, culture is not a nice to have, that you look at after the conversation around compensation, around who reports into you and your role. Culture is absolutely critical. And if you don't have that match right, all the rest is just simply going to be window dressing, and it's not going to be enough to make up for the fact that you're a square peg in a round hole.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a really important piece of the conversation, especially from the job seeker perspective, because I've done a lot of interviews in my time, and I will tell you the one question I always get from a candidate is, what does it look like to work here on a day-to-day basis, right? And you're like, for one, I can fake this answer like really easily. And two, like I don't have any incentive to make this sound like, I have all my incentive to make it sound good, right? Especially if you impress me so far with your resume, right? Or your interview. And so 0 times did anybody ask me a hard question about like, what's your leadership style, right? Like I'm coming at it from a hiring manager perspective. Like, what is your leadership style? This is the type of support that I know is beneficial to me from a leader. Is that something you think you could do? And I think it does have a lot to do with kind of that self-awareness. Definitely the power, right? Of even seeing like I'm going to own my power in this process. But having that self-awareness as well. I'm going to share this story because after I had left my job and I was trying to figure out, like, am I going to consult? Am I going to try and get a new job? Am I going to try and switch industries? Like, let's explore. And my dad was working on a project and he's like, I need project managers. She would be awesome at this. And I'm like, sure. Well, I'll have an interview. Like, you have all the skills. Okay, fine. I'll have an interview, right? Like, works on big projects. These people make a solid amount of money. So I'm like, this is good in between. Although one of the things I know about myself is that I cannot just sit and do a broken process over and over and over. Like, it will drive me nuts. It will make me want to quit. And so it was interesting because this came up in the conversation. I was like, one of the things I know about myself is that if I see a process that's broken, I want to fix it. Right. And I have a lot of experience. I'm very curious, right? Like, I am good at change management. And so it's actually something I'm quite good at, but I'm not good at just like sitting and working a broken process over and over and over. And the response I got was, well, we're far enough along this project that we wouldn't want to change anything now. And I'm like, from my dad's perspective, I knew that there was a lot of things that were broken. And I'm like, I'm not just going to go and sit and like manage broken processes for a lot of money. It's too frustrating for me. Yeah. And so it's like, I just like, these are the important things to know about yourself, because if I didn't know that about myself, did I have the skills? Yes. Did I want to do that job? No, I didn't want to do it. But if you're, as you mentioned, even sometimes you're looking to pay the bills and things like that, and you take a job that is available, so you can do that. And that's not a bad decision. I just want to make sure everybody knows that. That's not a bad decision. It is important to know, right? Like, I'm not going into this job for a long-term culture fit. I'm going into this job to make the necessary funds to keep my life going while I figure out what else I'm going to do. And so really owning that as part of I like to say it's part like your personal brand. You own your personal brand in the hiring process and bring that to the table. I want to kind of loop this back around to what we were talking about in terms of the learned helplessness, because Neil is sharing here that the fear and length of time to learn this helplessness can take a long time to undo without a sea of changing culture and leadership. And I think that's equally relevant from a job seeker perspective, especially if you're coming from an environment of fear and you have this learned helplessness. So I want to talk about, because I think really what we're looking at here is like, what makes it possible? What makes it possible to initiate this change in culture and leadership once you, again, realize you have to have the awareness that this dissonance is happening, but what does it take? What does it take to make a change in this arena?
Yeah, isn't that the $1 million question that every culture consultant in the world is trying to crack?
Look, and let's just be honest, it's not a 60-minute LinkedIn course you can take.
Look, I think just looping back to some of the points that you made and Neil's point, that you learn this, and it's and courage and accountability and initiative are all muscles, and if they atrophy for long enough, it can take a very long time to rediscover those things. And even with a sea change in culture and leadership, to my example of the story, you don't have to do this anymore. 3 months later, I'm still having conversations around something very minor in a very small team. We're only about 30 people in the department. So I think, I think there's a couple of things that in my experience make the difference, because of course, trying to shift cultures is something that's notoriously difficult. And that's why I think the examples of companies that have gotten right are so constantly repeated, because they're so unusual, because it's so difficult. And one of the things that I have learned that I didn't realize when I was first asked to do this, because I did not put up my hand to lead a culture change project, let me tell you. I was told that this is something I needed to do on behalf of the organization. And I still to this day don't know if I did something really right, but I'm guessing I did something really wrong and that this was a punishment, because I had no clue what I was doing. I mean, I'd led teams, I'd been an executive, but I set the culture because they were all new teams and new organizations. I didn't have to change a culture, which is way harder. And in that first culture change process, a lot of it was about trying to shock people into awareness that there was something seriously wrong. And this was the approach that the consultants that had been hired that I had to work with took. And I think there was value in that, but only up to a point. And for the rest, it just became white noise and they were blocked out. In the second culture change process with different people and different consultants and a different approach, I think what made it so much more possible and made it feel like we were actually getting some traction was we started with the positive and we amplified it. So that wonderful quote from William Gibson, the science fiction writer, that the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Finding the people who are already living the kind of culture that you want, finding the people who are doing this anyway, and then amplifying them and supporting and getting that out there, rather than coming in with what's broken and what's wrong and trying to scare people into fixing it. For me, look, I think there's multiple things. And like I said, these things are notoriously complex and you figure it out as you go along. But for me, that key unlock as a starting point, recognizing and celebrating what's positive without being naive and not acknowledging that there's things that are wrong. But that focus for me is much more powerful and profound in terms of a potential to unlock further things. It's not guaranteed, but it has a much stronger potential than other approaches I've seen.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this, because I have a theory about culture, the concept of culture change, because I do think that if there is a predominant culture, like the organization I came from, everyone else seemed to match and or was being bullied into matching. And I seem to be the outlier, right? So although I believe that the space I created is more supportive, more innovative, more creative, more teamy, all of those things, which I consider to be good, I was the outlier.
Yeah.
And so when I think it would have been a disaster to try and change the culture from what it was to what I believed it to be. And that is one of the reasons why I left, because I was like, this just isn't a good match. We're not aligned. This is, I'm going to go. And I've always had this question in my head, like let's just, so fictitious scenario. You are a leadership team, and these things, these values, these ideals are the things you are trying to live. Eventually you recognize that that's not what's happening, right? Like this is what we're trying to do. This is what we actually do by nature. This is who we are as a company. My theory is that it's much easier to accept who you are as a company and revise your documented or projected culture to find those type of people who match who you are and how you do things, instead of saying like, now we have to transition how everybody does things to do something different. So what are your thoughts in this fictitious
scenario? Look, if it's good enough, it's good enough. Fine, just carry on. You know, the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if it's not good enough and there are some real costs, personal costs, professional costs, opportunity costs, strategic costs, then this has to become a major priority. And this is why in the work that I've always done around culture, it's always been fascinating, because I say to execs, listen, I'm not coming at this from a human resources point of view. I mean, no disrespect to human resources, but my background is strategy. And so it is way easier to change your strategy than it is to change your culture. Change the slides, you change your strategy. Change your culture is going to take concerted, continuous effort, and it's going to be way harder than you think. But frankly, if you've got this strategy, so for example, a client had an ecosystem strategy, which on the slides made perfect sense. Oh yeah, absolutely. You guys have got all the building blocks. You can give a unified answer to a client. Fantastic. I love it. Oh, but let's just have a quick look at the culture. This culture is so endemically us and them that it is polar opposite to the strategy. And frankly, if you are betting the house on this strategy, this culture is going to destroy it. This culture is not even going to allow it to get out of the starting blocks. I mean, if the strategy was the same and the us and them was fine, well, then, like I say, continue. But when you have got diametrically opposed intentions from a strategy and a culture, then something's got to give. And then, like I say, you either change your strategy and change your expectations, or you put in the very hard graft of actually stepping up to that culture and realizing it's probably going to be one of the most challenging things you've ever done in your leadership career. And are you up for it? Because if you're not up for it, just, don't irritate everyone. Don't disappoint everyone. Don't even go there. But if you are up for it, you need to be in for it for the long haul.
Mm-hmm. I think I see this over and over again in individual people deciding to make changes, companies deciding to make changes, is it has to be painful, right? And I think that you've used the phrase diametrically opposed a couple of times, and it reminds me of Hamilton, and now the music is just playing in my head, so it's a little distracting. But this is the thing, right? Like if your culture and your strategy are diametrically opposed foes, then this is not going to work. And we spend so much time on strategy, right? And we put a lot of time, effort, energy into doing that, especially from a leadership perspective, and trying to create space for our team to be able to implement those strategies. And if we have a culture that is just continually hammering away at what we're trying to do on the strategy side, I think this is a really great place to start looking into that, right? Like, is this something that we need to address? Because no matter what we choose from a strategy and tactic perspective, we can't make it work, right? Like, it never helps that way.
I think it goes, so I think if the jury's out as to whether Peter Drucker actually said that, but I mean, hasn't that phrase been used repeatedly, because it resonates with all of us, and there's a variation of it, that culture eats strategy for breakfast and innovation for lunch and dinner. So I mean, again, I don't know, it seems to be apocryphal that he said it, but if these two are at odds, listen, I've seen this movie and how it ends, and it's not a happy ending. So don't even go there. I mean, just be realistic and pragmatic around what's possible here.
Mm-hmm. I want to tie in what David is sharing here because he's talking about looking at this like culture from a recruiter perspective, right? So making sure that you know your culture and
Yes.
not just focusing on putting butt in the seats, but matching a candidate's
Yes.
values with the corporate
Yes.
culture. And so I do think I think it happens from a recruiter perspective. I think it happens from like a middle management hiring perspective as well, is that and you know what, this is really interesting because when I worked in corporate, I thought I was a terrible hirer, right? Like I would hire people and they would stay for their 3 months of probation, and then either they would choose to leave or we would let them go. And my story, and it was perpetrated by my manager as well, is that I was bad at hiring. So I needed to learn how to be good at hiring. But what I realized after I left is that my culture and the organization's culture aren't the same thing. So when we're trying to hire for both of those things, we failed every single time because they can't hire for two completely different cultures. It doesn't work. And then we try and find somebody who's like this in between, which is really just somebody who wants to just come and be a butt in a seat, right? Like, and like, I don't want to hire someone who wants to just be a butt in a seat. I want to hire somebody who wants to come and participate and share ideas. And anyway, this is what I was looking for, not what the organization was looking for. And so like, maybe just share some stories that you have, Niven, on what can we do from this, like, if we're in the middle, if we're the meat in the sandwich and we're not really dictating, like we, to some degree, like everybody participates in the ecosystem of the culture. So to some degree, we all dictate the culture, but if we're not the high level leaders and we're responsible for bringing in the entry level people, what are some of the things that we need to do to make that less painful for ourselves?
So I think there's two things that strike me as you're speaking. The one is, I think even in an overall culture, look, there's always going to be subcultures. Yes, they take their cue from and are derivative of the overall culture, but I think all managers, any manager, can still create a subculture that's healthier than the overall culture necessarily. I mean, you have to be careful around it because you're not you're not a one-man show and you're not entirely off by yourself. But there's that beautiful phrase from Margaret Wheatley where she talks about leaders creating islands of sanity. And I love that phrase. Yeah, can I just create an island of sanity here? Look, that will also take its toll after a certain amount of time. So if you're constantly buffering and buffeting the waves of the insanity because you don't match the environment and you're protecting your team, that can eventually wear you down as well. But I think all managers have a possibility and an opportunity and frankly a responsibility to create that island and to protect their team from the most dysfunctional sides of organizations. I think the second thing is, I don't know if it's I don't know what the general lesson is from this, but I do remember a conversation with a very senior Exco team who were locked in this downward spiral, this negative feedback loop, so they were Exco and then there was a Manco just below them. And the Exco was tearing their hair out because they said every time we get stuff from Manco, it doesn't look like these guys have applied their minds. It doesn't look like they've really thought through issues. And so here we are as Exco having to redo everything and reverse their decisions and say no to things. Of course, if you spoke to the Manco guys, they said, oh, do me a favor. It doesn't matter how much we apply our minds here. It almost feels like it's a badge of honor for them to reverse and ignore everything that we're saying. So eventually we're not going to apply our minds anymore because there's no point. Which then, of course, makes ESCO more frustrated that they're the only people in the whole organization who are thinking. And so this was playing out. And what I played back to EXCO was, given this dynamic, I think it's really incumbent on you to ask yourself two questions. And it's a Hobson's choice in terms of the questions and the answers. I mean, the first question is there something fundamentally broken in the hiring process here that you are permanently hiring people who are stupid at very senior levels? In which case, that needs to be fixed pronto? Or more likely, is there something in the culture that is bringing in very smart people and making them stupid? Because they are so constrained, they are so contained, they're so micromanaged and second guessed that eventually, they either leave or they say, stuff it, I'll stay for the golden handcuffs, but I'm physically checking out and mentally checking out. And in that, again, it's a muscle that starts to atrophy, and it's a level of frustration that only starts to build from your side. So I think both of those are true, that the broader leadership sets the tone, and subcultures can also exist, which can be, as more subcultures that are more healthy than the overall culture, or equally subcultures that are way less healthy, and people get away with it.
Yeah, that's definitely true in my experience. Is that what I would say is that my team was a subculture, and I went to work every day to buffer the waves away from the island, and it just got too much for me, right? And then it was really interesting because I stayed as long as I did because of my team, because I wanted to protect my team. And I was like, I can't protect these guys from this forever, because I'm starting to fail protecting myself from it. So I need to leave, and within 6 months, my entire team had left. But it's really interesting just to think about this, because I could see lots of, and the company I worked for, not a huge company, right? We're not talking about like tens of thousands of employees. We're talking about a small startup, right? And there's like 3 teams, and each of them ran very differently. And I can imagine now that the way I ran my team, because it was in such conflict with how the other teams were run, it didn't make it easy for the teams to interact together, right? And then because each of the leaders was coming from such a different place of protecting, the whole fact that we even felt like we needed to protect our team, to me, is like not the goal. If the leaders feel like they need to protect their team, then we have a conversation that needs to be had. But it's like the moments, the energy where everything like starts to fall apart, right? Like, I'm going to do all this work, and then you guys are just going to totally redo it. So how much of that effort, if we were measuring it, is being wasted, right?
No, enormous. Yeah, and conversely, we were speaking about how culture can destroy your strategy, or not even give it a chance to go anywhere. Conversely, I think when the culture is right and people are aligned, doesn't mean that they're in lockstep and uniform agreement. There's groupthink. I'm not saying that, but when there's alignment and coherence and not dissonance, resonance. Gosh, when you see, and I've seen that a few times in my career, in teams, in departments, in organizations, when you see a culture pull a strategy, geez, I mean, I think that's got to be one of the most rewarding things as a leader, as a manager, because you just step back and you watch the magic happen, because there is something magical about it, because the whole really is greater than the sum of the parts in ways that you couldn't have anticipated. You didn't design, you didn't plan, but things just happen. And people grow. And, Liz Wiseman's wonderful book, Multipliers, people become more than they thought they could be. They give more than 100%, which mathematically is impossible. But actually, it's perfectly possible in how human beings show up when suddenly something shifts. Shifts in them, shifts in the culture, shifts in what's possible. I mean, I have loved those times in my career, and recognized that I may have been a catalyst, but once it had momentum, I just step back and watch it happen.
Yeah.
Celebrated.
I think that's the amazing thing, right? When you get that feeling of, yes, I belong here, right? Like, people see me, people hear me, I get to make a contribution. I'm equally invested in my teammates and them making their contribution. It's actually fun because it's making me think of the organization that I worked for. And I ended up having to leave that job because of a personal move. But I cried when I handed in my resignation, because I didn't want to leave. I felt like it was my place. And from the time, like, I had been headhunted by them into that job. And from the time I was like first in the office, I was like, this feels like my people. Right. And that doesn't mean we didn't disagree. That doesn't mean that I didn't make mistakes and felt bad about it. It doesn't mean any of those things, because we're humans and those things are going to happen. But it just felt like I'm safe here. It's safe for me to fail. It's safe for me to succeed. I don't have to. It's safe for me to be me. And that, I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about psychological safety. At some point, I'll have an episode about that. But these are the things, right? I like to use the word vibe because I go a lot by vibes, right? And when the culture is just vibing, it's like it pulls the strategy, and the tactics start to become just like, oh yeah, we'll do that. We don't have to spend so many mental calories on figuring out what tactics and strategy we're going to do, because our culture is just like leading us forward. And yeah, I do. It is just an amazing place to be. And I think it's a really great inspirational goal for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's exactly what Csikszentmihalyi spoke about in terms of flow.
Mhm.
That feeling of, okay, something's happening here that's bigger than me and bigger than all of us, but it has a life of its own, and it's beautiful. It really is beautiful.
Yeah, an organism, right? Like, this is what we are. We're all people interacting together, and every one of us has a contribution and an energy. And if those things are aligned, then just try and stop us. Just try and stop us. So great. So let's wrap it up for there today, Niven. If people are looking for some resources or a great place to understand a little bit more about culture dissonance and some things that we might be able to do to deal with that scenario, where can they find you, and what would you recommend their next step be?
So I put a whole bunch of things up on my website, so nivenpostma.com. I really believe strongly in this idea of paying it forward. So I've got a couple of slide decks up there, one around what I think about strategy, two, what I think about culture. What is it? How does it work? What are some of the ways you can approach it? So it's certainly not a DIY guide, because I think every single one of these is so different. You have to figure it out as you go along. But certainly, thank you. That's me. But certainly, I think there are some general principles that I've learned, and sometimes I wish other clients and other leaders knew. And then I think, for me, there's no ways you're going to do this by yourself. Even as a CEO, you need to have a coalition of support. And if you're working with outside consultants, I was absolutely adamant in all the work that I did. Listen, I am not abdicating or outsourcing this to you. I am bringing you in as a partner, because we're going to have to think about this together. But I own this in this organization, and I'm spearheading it. I need support. I need troops. But the moment you abdicate this, either to a department or to a bunch of consultants, or you think, we'll get to that next week because right now we've got really pressing things that we've got to worry about, it just slowly dissipates. This is something where entropy takes over very quickly. And I suppose the last thing that I've always strongly believed is that financial indicators, of course, they're critical. I mean, they're the lifeblood of organizations. But let's not make the mistake of not realizing that they are lag indicators. They only tell us what has happened. The people stuff, the culture stuff will tell you what is going to happen, because they're the lead indicators. And this is not soft and fluffy cupcakes and kisses, kumbaya stuff. This is fundamental. This is the real engine room of strategy and organizations. And I think anybody who is still talking to me about soft skills, I mean, I try to be polite and keep a screensaver expression, but frankly, I think you've missed a very fundamental point around the nature of organizations, the nature of human beings. And I think it was Patty McCord from Netflix who said it beautifully. I mean, when did people become human resources? Resources? No. People are the source of every single thing, good or bad, that's going to happen in your organization. And if you don't get that, nothing I can say is going to help you understand that. You're going to have to learn that the hard way.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a wonderful place to stop, because if we can all just take away today that people are the source of everything good and bad that happens in your organization. These are the things we need to remember, right?
Mm.
And yes, let's take a look and let's explore what could a culture transformation, or even just exploring whether or not our employees have dissonance with our culture, how can that help the bottom line, right? Like, and how many, we talked about this, like how much time, effort, and energy is being wasted in the pieces of our culture that conflict. So what if we took that same amount of time in the exploration of how can we do this differently? What's actually going on here? I think it's a great way to spend our time. So, but that's why we had this conversation today. So, Niven, thank you so much. Thank you for all of our participants who showed up, and we're super happy that you guys came and shared your perspectives as well. You guys can find Niven on her website. She's actually also very active on the LinkedIn platform. She's tagged in the post for this live, so you can just click on her name and connect with her if you're not connected already. And stay in the conversation. This is one of the things that I am most passionate about, and Niven mentioned it in throughout the conversation as well. Is this is not like a 5-minute thing we do, right? Like, I'll change my culture by just switching on this light bulb. Right? Not a thing. It happens by participating on an ongoing basis in the conversation, keeping these types of things forefront in your mind, right? That people are the source. How are we supporting the people? Is there a way we could better support the people? Do our people feel like they belong? How is this happening in the hiring process? And a million other questions that you can have in the arena. So it's so important to stay in the conversation, especially if you are a leader, a recruiter, a potential future leader, right? Like, you're starting your own business and you want to make sure that as you grow, you're not creating this culture dissonance from the beginning, right?
Yes.
This is the conversation to stay in, to make sure that those things stay top of mind. So get connected to Niven, get connected to me if we're not already connected. I think most of us are connected already, and stay in the conversation so that we can make sure that this happens less and less.
Oh, amen.
Awesome. And just quickly to address this, David, yes, it is LinkedIn Live, so it will live in infamy on my LinkedIn Live page, but the better place to find it is actually on YouTube. So once we're finished broadcasting, it will buffer for a minute on YouTube, and then if you want, just message me and I'll send you the YouTube link, and you can forward it over to them. And with that, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Niven, for all of your wonderful insights. And until next time, everybody, permission to do you.